Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us again. There has been no meeting of the Greater Manchester COVID Emergency Committee this week. That's because we've got our first ever virtual Greater Manchester Combined Authority meeting on Friday, where, of course, we'll discuss the crisis, but our clean air plans, amongst other things as well. So it's an open public forum, and you're all very welcome to tune in to that. But we wanted to give you the regular update. So I will start with the figures, and I'll try and go through them reasonably slowly, so everyone can take a note of them. So over the last week, we have seen 349 new cases of coronavirus in Greater Manchester, up from 9,399 to 9,748. The regional R number still stands at 0.73, so there's been no change yet. It's not been updated. That's the number for the Northwest, of course. In terms of the hospital figures, we have 65 people in intensive care across Greater Manchester with COVID-19. That's down from 77 this time last week. And we have 591 patients in other hospital beds, down from 673. In terms of deaths, sadly, we've got to report another 53 deaths in Greater Manchester over the last week. That figure overall now stands at 1,755, when we think of all of the families who've been affected by this terrible virus. So overall, the picture again is an improving picture, although, as ever, there are always outlying statistics that we need to keep an eye on. One of those being the number of daily admissions to hospital. Yesterday stood at 25, a week ago was 18. So, obviously difficult to draw any conclusions over two pieces of snapshot data, but nevertheless something for us to watch. The position in care homes is gradually improving, although still a cause for concern. Overall, 362 care homes in Greater Manchester have reported an outbreak. That's not necessarily with a current outbreak, but throughout the crisis have been in a position where they had to report at least one. That's increased by 8 over the last week. So there is still a concern that the virus is still spreading in some care homes. As a percentage of all care homes in Greater Manchester, the percentage of care homes that currently have a resident with the virus, today that stands at 28%, down from 31% last week. So again, movement in the right direction, although I think too early to say that the problem has gone away. It certainly hasn't. There's still a very significant challenge for our care homes, and we are working to support them with that. Just to go through a couple of other pieces of general update before I introduce the Deputy Mayor, Baroness Beverly Hughes, just to talk about the policing situation. I thought you might find it useful to have an update on schools across our 10 boroughs. The update is this: 5 of our boroughs are working with schools on a return date of between the 8th and the 10th of June. Important to say that for many of those boroughs and schools, the 1st of June was never really an option because that was always the planned half-term date. So just important to bear that in mind. 3 boroughs are planning on a return next week, 1st of June, and 2 of our boroughs are working on a school-by-school basis, working with head teachers and obviously in all cases carrying out a full risk assessment. What I can say from my point of view is that I support whatever decision our councils are taking. I support their right to take a decision in the best interests of students, staff, and the wider community. Since the last briefing, we have had news from the government on the funding of public transport, and in particular the Metrolink system. And we welcomed what was said by the Transport Secretary at Saturday's briefing, namely that the Metrolink system would get the vast majority of what we need to run the system until August. And the package that's been proposed would actually allow us to increase the frequency up from the 12-minute service, which was introduced yesterday. So positive news there. And I thank the Transport Secretary for listening to our concerns. Only caveat I would place on that is this was a deal that was announced up until August. And obviously in London, a longer term deal was put in place. If Greater Manchester is to plan with certainty for the recovery, I would ask the government to give us longer planning horizons so that we can obviously give that greater that security of service for a longer period. But I don't want to pick holes. The announcement was welcome and we're grateful to the government for it. Just lastly from me before I introduce Bev, I just wanted to update on homelessness because it's a continuing focus for the government, and that is welcome for us to see the personal commitment which the Secretary of State is putting into this. For our own part, we have helped 1,724 people under the scheme that Greater Manchester announced at the start of this crisis, and I'm sure you'll agree with me that that represents a monumental effort on behalf of our charities, councils and partners across the housing system. As of today, we have around 661 people in accommodation, and we're continuing to work to provide options for people to move through. What we can also report, though, is the weekly demand for accommodation is running at about 180 per week. And this is an issue that I think the government needs to take on board, that the current circumstances are actually creating homelessness and a demand for support. And it's a point I've raised before at this briefing. The government's position is only to support those identified as homeless before the lockdown. What we are experiencing is a growing problem of people being made homeless in the current situation. And this is the issue that we would have with the, again, welcome announcement at the weekend of 6,000 new properties to support efforts to make this a lasting moment, a moment of lasting change on homelessness. Again, it applies only to those identified as homeless before the lockdown. We would appeal again for the government to remove that distinction because we're trying to help people identified before or since. It doesn't matter. Everyone in should mean everyone in, and we will continue to work to support people on that basis. So that's enough for me for now. I'll come back in a moment before your questions, but I'm now going to hand over to the Deputy Mayor, Baroness Beverly Hughes. Bev.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, just a report really on what's been happening over the last few days in Greater Manchester from a policing and fire point of view. You'll be aware that there was a very significant, or could have been a very significant fire in the city centre at the Lighthouse on the 24th of May. That's a high-rise block, mixed use, residential, hospitality and retail. The fire started on the balcony of the 5th floor. And although the investigation has not yet concluded, the fire service feel that the most likely cause is a cigarette discarded from a higher floor that landed on the balcony of a flat on the 5th floor and set alight some inflammable furnishings that then set the whole of the balcony on fire and also affected the flat on the 4th floor. The fire service and the police working together, I must say, they really did a commendable job, both in terms of stopping the fire, but also in getting people out to safe places, respecting the social distance requirements and reassuring people. So that could have been a lot worse, but it was handled very well. Secondly, just to tell you that unfortunately yesterday, there was the 3rd domestic homicide reported in Greater Manchester. This is the 3rd, I should say, during the lockdown period. And although I've reported on the incidents of domestic abuse before, because it's something we've been monitoring very, very carefully and had a very strong communications campaign for the public via all our voluntary organisations, via local radio, to reassure people that the police are still attending, and they are. And the incidents generally of domestic abuse that the police have been called to have not significantly risen. They've gone up and down from day to day, but they've been in and around the norm for daily reports. it is obviously of very salutary concern that 3 women have died in a domestic situation as a result of being attacked and killed by family members. Thirdly, just to say in terms of over the weekend and events, it was Eid over this weekend, the celebration of the end of Ramadan, and I think due to a great deal of planning and conversation between neighbourhood police officers, between members of the local councils of mosques, and indeed many local councillors, there was a great deal of planning for that, and I really want to say thank you to the Muslim community, because there's a very, very high level of respect for the regulations at the moment, and Eid passed across Greater Manchester without any incident at all, and I think that's a great thank you to them for that. Over this period too, perhaps because the weather wasn't quite as good as we thought it might have been, the number of gatherings was not as great as it had been over previous holiday weekends, although still significant, with I think 580 house parties or gatherings the police were called to or attended over the 4-day period from the 22nd of May to the 25th. No arrests, only 5 penalty notices were issued. All of those actually were to people from Birmingham who'd come to Manchester for the weekend. That said, however, I think we are all aware that there is a lot more activity on the streets. There is a lot more congregation of people for social purposes, maybe not in very large gatherings, but in smaller gatherings, outside premises and so on. And very, very aware that the adherence to the regulations as they stand at the moment are beginning to fracture. The police will continue to do what they have been doing, which is focusing on encouraging people, reassuring people. But really, I think we need the government to clarify now, as I understand they're going to towards the end of this week, what members of the public will absolutely be required to do, and clarify for the police, therefore, what they will be expected to enforce. Because I think the extent to which people now are feeling that the social distancing requirements anyway are loosening means that really that is almost impossible now for the police to deal with, apart from the very obvious large gatherings which they have been attending to over the weekend. I think that's it, Andy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bev. Just a couple more points from me before we open up for your questions. Just in the context of what Bev was describing of a changing picture with a number of people out and about, I want to raise my concerns today around the announced policy of local lockdowns. Again, there has been minimal consultation with mayors, combined authorities and local authorities about this policy. And it raises very real challenges with regard to the enforceability of any local lockdown, and indeed the fairness of having one community locked down or partially locked down next door to another which is not, and the tensions that may arise from a situation like that. We hear talk today from ministers about parts of towns being locked down. That seems to me to be a very challenging concept, or whether it's just individual buildings. Well, that might be more possible, but still, this is a policy that causes me great concern, and I struggle to understand how it can be effectively enforced. It shouldn't be necessary, because we should have a testing and tracking system of such strength that we wouldn't need to think about localized lockdown of this kind. And I think effort should be there, focusing on getting that right, as opposed to drawing up plans which in effect are the result of a failure to track and trace if you have to then put part of a community under lockdown. So I wanted to use this briefing today to express significant concerns about this. Throughout, I've said I have concerns about how you would enforce a localized or a regionalized lockdown, and those concerns remain. We wait to see the detail of what the government puts forward, but it's just to register significant concerns, and concerns shared by many of our leaders who I've spoken to today. But then moving on from that, it's to make the point about how such a policy is practical in the current climate with events over the weekend. From my point of view, there's two problems here. The current political climate is undermining the strength of the government's message. Secondly, it's leading to a loss of focus on the crisis that we are in and still grappling with. The cases may be down in Greater Manchester, but the fact that we had almost 350 new cases last week and early signs, but possibly rising hospital admissions, shows there can be no loss of focus and no let up in the fight against this virus. And yet what we've seen in the last few days is a weakening of the government's authority when it comes to their public health messaging. And secondly, a loss of focus on the key issues. And my call today would be for urgent action to be taken by the government to regain a grip and to get the focus back where it needs to be. So, Ross, that'll be it from me for now, and over to you and the questions.
Thanks very much, Andy. There's two questions about the Prime Minister's advisor, Dominic Cummings. The first one's from Adam Clark at Roch Valley Radio, which says, many people across the country have called for the resignation of the Prime Minister's top advisor, Dominic Cummings. Some MPs have also broken lockdown rules. Do you think that they should also resign from their posts? And the second point is a question for both Andy and Bev from Michael Gaffney at Heart and Smooth at 203. Have GMPs seen a public pushback against the lockdown in the wake of the Dominic Cummings row?
So I'll leave the second question to Bev, Ross, but I'll take the first one. I think probably in common with other mayors, I've not got involved basically with this story over the weekend, because it's obviously a very Westminster situation, and it's not necessarily right, or indeed what I've tried to do through this. I've kept my focus on the issues in the real world and the things that we need to do to get a grip on this situation and keep people safe. What I would say is, I think the political story of the weekend has had an impact in the real world, as I said, both in terms of weakening the strength of the government's public health message and then potential enforceability issues that arise from that, and also the loss of focus on things like testing, contact tracing, which are still not in the right place and where there needs to be a lot of focus. So for me, from my point of view, it's for others to enter the who said what to who. All I can report today is there is a real impact, it seems to me, in our fight against this virus, and that can't continue. And it's why I say the government should take a very firm grip on it. If we carry on in a kind of world of Westminster politicking, then I think we are going to get ourselves into the wrong position. Action needs to be taken to restore public trust and a line be drawn. But I'll hand over to Bev for the second part.
Thanks, Andy. Well, Michael, I've talked to the Chief Constable today, actually, and I think that the GMP would say, no, there isn't a pushback in the sense that people are actively resisting the lockdown and protesting against it. But I think the police would say, and I agree with them from what I've seen over the last few days, that people now are no longer taking as seriously the rules of lockdown and are feeling that they can go about things, particularly social activities, particularly younger groups of people, and socialise together in a way that they haven't been doing until the last few days. So it's not an active pushback, but it is a lessening of the feeling that they need to abide by these rules any longer.
Thanks very much, Bev. I'm going to go take the second part of Adam Clark's question for Andy, which is Metrolink. Obviously, you mentioned the funding deal, but Metrolink has increased now frequency as a result every 12 minutes as of yesterday. It might be too early to say, but has there been an increase in the use of Metrolink since yesterday? Do we have any stats on that?
I'm afraid it is a little early to say that, Adam. I should have those stats later today, and we can get them to you if you're interested. What we've seen over the last week, 10 days, is a gradual increase in Metrolink patronage day by day. So it's creeping up by a percentage point every day or so. I think it's probably now into low double figures, but I can give you the statistics on that. What we can do as of probably not immediately, but within a week or two, is increase the frequency of services again. And this is why we were so strongly pushing for a funding deal from the government. It's the ability to put on extra services that then allows us to manage the extra numbers of people using Metrolink in a safe manner where social distancing can be respected on trams. So the funding package at the weekend was good news. We would like to see it extended beyond August, but I will certainly be coming back to you quite soon with plans to increase the frequency of Metrolink services as we see retail return and possibly more and more people doing the morning commute.
Thanks, Andy. Two questions on the hospitality industry. The first one's from Andy Smith at Wish FM and Tower FM. Pubs, restaurants and the hospitality industry are obviously struggling with no clear date as to when they could reopen. What are your thoughts on how and when this industry can get going again? And secondly, will the hospitality industry need support post-lockdown, given many will have to apply to social distancing rules? And a similar question from Michael Gaffney, 203, just underneath that. You'll have probably seen the footage of a rowdy, non-socially distanced mass gathering in Ancoats over the bank holiday weekend. Public realm like Cutting Room Square will be hugely important to getting the hospitality industry back up and running. So how can we do it safely, especially with that when alcohol is involved?
Again, Ross, maybe Bev might like to just come in on the second part of that. But you're absolutely right to raise, Andy, the challenges facing the hospitality industry. They're huge, and we're conscious that they're the lifeblood of our city region. That brings so many visitors here. It's what we're known for in many ways. So the industry will really need our support going forward. Sasha Lord, our nighttime economy advisor, has been working with Councillor Elise Wilson, our economy and business portfolio lead, with a task force looking specifically at what can be done to help the industry. Are there any steps that can be taken in the short term around more space for outside tables, etc., and cutting through some of the red tape that businesses might face. So we are looking to help them in whatever way we can. And I have sent the message to the let's say the office-based organisations of the city centre, the major employers in the city centre, that we can't give up on the city centre. We want to obviously do things carefully and gradually, but bringing a certain amount of people back to the office is about supporting the city centre economy, and we recognise the need to get that balance right. Obviously, safety led at all times, but in a position to support the businesses who will need to be supported. I think an argument will need to be made to the government around continuing access to a furlough scheme, because their return to work will probably be more gradual, as you say, than other industries. So it's going to be a challenge. There's no doubt about that. The industry will really need our support, but they will have that support from the Greater Manchester level, both in terms of what we can do to help them, but also in terms of making the case to government for more support for the industry. On the second point, I'll just say a quick thing before handing over to Bev. We are aware of some reports of pubs being open, not to bring people inside, but obviously to sell for takeaway purposes, and then gatherings outside of pubs. And the pub in Ancoats was mentioned. I was pleased to see the responsible action taken by the brewery in this case, Seven Sisters Brewery, and that is something I'd like to see more across the board. It's got to be a bit of a quid pro quo here. We'll be ready to help our pubs, restaurants, bars, whatever, but we also need them to be working with us to maintain good public order and social distancing, respect for the rules. So I was glad that they took that action, but there are more that I would be asking to do exactly the same. But Bev might want to add to that.
Thank you. Thanks, Andy. I think, to be honest, as I mentioned before, I think given the situation that we're in, we're likely to see towards the end of this week clarification around the role of the police in maintaining social distancing. And I think given the direction of travel, I think it's hard to see a continuing role for the police in trying to maintain social distance, and I suspect that will be made an issue of personal responsibility. But in those situations of hospitality, the police will continue to do their core business, so they will maintain public order, they will intervene if there's antisocial behaviour or any threat to people's safety. However, I think it will be increasingly individuals, but also in those situations, business owners themselves, who will want to try and ensure that the arrangements they implement will help people to maintain a social distance. Because, whether the rules are being relaxed or not, whether the responsibility is being put back onto all of us as individuals to respect that, clearly, from a health point of view, it still needs to be respected. There is still the risk of contagion and infection. People are still getting this illness and will do so possibly in increasing numbers if people get too close together. So there must be some responsibility somewhere for helping people to maintain the distance one from another.
Thanks very much, Bev. Could I go to two questions on local lockdown? Go to Andy initially. I know you've touched on this already, but just in case there's anything you want to add to what you've said or reiterate or pick up on some of these points. Andy, you've said in the past that you don't necessarily agree with having lockdowns in some part of the country and not others. How do you feel about Matt Hancock's announcement that there may be localised lockdowns, and how would this work in Greater Manchester? It would be done as a whole, by borough or by pockets, or villages, towns, etc. And that's from Grace at Revolution Radio at 203. And Hannah Miller Granada also asks at 204. Robert Jenrick said today that local lockdowns might include finely tuned lockdowns such as school, workplace, hospital. Have you been consulted on local lockdowns at all, and what do you make of it?
Well, thank you both, Grace and Hannah. To start with what Grace asked, how would this work in Greater Manchester? I'm not entirely sure, Grace, if I'm honest with you. I think the complexity of implementing and enforcing a policy of this kind is huge. And the ability to have one community or parts of one community under these provisions, but the neighbouring community next door not, I just, for me, it feels fraught with difficulties. And I would much have preferred there to be strong testing, tracking, isolating arrangements in place before these policies were even put out there. I think it's that will build public confidence. I think localized lockdowns could inflame tensions and could in fact do the opposite. Now, I think picking up what Hannah was asking, whether it's just linked to a physical building such as a school or workplace or a hospital, well, obviously that you can imagine how that would be easier to implement. But I don't know if that is just what the government are thinking. We've heard mention of parts of towns today from the community secretary. And I just think I'm reflecting what I hear from the leaders as well. There's just a lot of concern about how you do this in the current climate when we're struggling anyway, as the Deputy Mayor has said, to kind of maintain a sense of buy-in to the big message. So I think the government needs to tread carefully. I think the key is building public confidence in testing and tracing. That is where we will, I think, make the biggest difference here. If we rush into a localized lockdown policy, then I think it's a recipe for chaos, to be honest. And I think there has been some discussion with officers, but I'm afraid very little, in fact, no consultation at a political level between government ministers and ourselves. We are in the dark as to this policy, even though it will have a major impact on us. And I'm afraid it follows a pattern that we've seen on PPE testing and now this.
Thanks very much. I'm going to go to a question from Niall Griffiths at the MEN at 2:04. Andy, do you think the conditions are right for all the non-essential shops to reopen in Manchester from mid-June as announced by the Prime Minister?
Well, certainly the time frame now gives me more confidence that the conditions can be right. This isn't being rushed. It seems to me to be sensible to set a mid-June date for this change. If we hadn't have had the Metrolink package, I would have said I would be worried, because obviously I wouldn't have been able to give any guarantees about the safely managing the travelling without that extra frequency of trams. That is a confidence builder that we've got more transport capacity in place. I think the issue is the issue that the Deputy Mayor was touching on a moment ago, not necessarily how you would maintain social distancing within a particular shop, because I think they are looking at one-way systems, aren't they, and markings on the ground. The issue may come in terms of people queuing across each other for different shops. You could certainly see that being a challenge in somewhere like the Trafford Centre or the Arndale, or even outside on Market Street. So the management of queues outside of shops, I think, is an issue that will need to be carefully managed. And I would encourage all retailers to think carefully about that and consult with neighbouring retailers to ensure we don't get difficult scenes outside of shops as people queue to get in.
Thanks, Andy. A question from Helen Pidd at The Guardian at 2:06. Are GM local authorities and GPs now receiving data from the Pillar 2 private tests done at drive-thrus and via post and overseen by Deloitte? So do you have detailed data on where the current outbreaks are?
So, no, I don't think so, Helen. I think agreements have been reached, but I'm pretty sure that we still do not receive the data on a regular basis. And even if we do, it's very headline level. It's not, the names, postcodes, professions of the different people being tested, because there is a concern about whether that was even captured in the first place. But I'm pretty confident in saying that we are not receiving that information. The figures I gave to you at the start of this briefing for the number of new cases in Greater Manchester does not include Pillar 2 testing. It's only Pillar 1 testing, the more community based testing. So there is still a problem with us receiving the Pillar 2 data. And even if we do receive it, it is of limited value, because I think this data arises from a system where there was a chasing of the target. It was a case of just getting numbers through rather than properly understanding who we were testing and why we were testing and what we were then doing with that data. So I think major concerns still exist about this, but we are reassured by the work of Tom Reardon, who's been appointed to integrate local and national testing and tracking systems, and we hope that that will soon bring a solution to the problem. I will double check, Helen, after this briefing to see whether there's been any progress that I'm not aware of, and Ross or one of the team will update you if I'm out of date with my understanding of the situation. But I certainly know that the GM cases I gave to you do not include Pillar 2 data.
Thanks, Andy. Another health question from Kevin Gopal at Big Issue North. Could you comment on the Health Service Journal report today that Sir Mike Deegan has written to national officials saying the devolved system was close to securing a deal for 1 million face masks a week with a Salford firm, but it has been held up because it was forced through a national response system? Have you or Sir Mike had a response?
Well, thanks, Kevin. To be honest with you, I'm not aware of that, so I will have to take that one away, and I will have to come back to you about that. So it's not one that I was aware of, but we will come back to you with an answer on
Thanks. A question for Bev from Niall at the MEN. Do you have any updates on speeding offences being reported by GMP? It's been a month since the Chief Constable said that 4 in 10 drivers were found to be speeding while taking advantage of quieter roads. Now that the roads are slowly starting to get busier, has this changed at all? That's Niall Griffiths at 216.
Thanks, Niall. I don't have any very recent data, except to say that I think the week before last there was a national coordinated exercise across the country by police services because of the concern about speeding. As you say, though, the roads are really getting much busier. Certainly, cycling around South Manchester, where I was over the bank holiday weekend, it's really noticeable. That has slowed the traffic down, although it's not done a great deal for the lovely clean air that we've had over the past few weeks. I will try and get some information across to you if we've got anything to report later today.
Thank you. Another one from Helen. Oh, actually, sorry, I'm going to take Grace from Revolution Radio, and it's for Andy. Andy, you've mentioned trams, but what's the latest update when it comes to buses in Greater Manchester?
Thanks, Grace. So the latest on buses is that the government is talking to the bus industry and the bus operators with a view to increasing the number of services that they're providing, and it's not due to the nature of the bus industry. This is not something, obviously, that comes via us. It's a direct conversation the government is having with them. I understand there's an aim to raise the number of bus services being provided back up towards 100% of a normal timetable, but I'm not aware that a deal has yet been done. It may be that it was included in what was announced at the weekend. I'm not sure. I'm not caught up on that yet, but it's going to be for the government to do rather than to be done at the GM level.
Thanks, Andy. Another question from Helen at The Guardian at 216. What can you tell us about the track and trace plans that are developing in Greater Manchester? How are the local authorities involved? What proportion of the 300 million has Greater Manchester received? And what is Tameside's role as the pilot reporting authority?
Well, thanks, Helen. We're pleased that Greater Manchester has been recognised as a pilot, and Tameside is our lead borough within that pilot. And our aim is to have an enhanced tracking and tracing system in Greater Manchester, and that's what we're working towards, drawing on the expertise that exists within our public health departments. So we're wanting to develop a system that is obviously consistent with the government's approach, that fits into the national system, but is strong in terms of the level of assurance that we can provide to our residents, so that we want to maximise the local input into the system, because that's where we believe the quality will come from. And the plans that we've developed that went through the COVID Emergency Committee last week are about identifying those kind of locations where we think we need to really focus if we're to get this system working properly. So, for instance, care homes, any form of institutional care, actually, care for young people. It might also be our homelessness settings, prison and probation settings. We're developing a strategy that's going to look at the most at-risk locations, and then be sure that we can move quickly if there are any reports of cases.
Thanks. I'm going to go to Nigel Barlow from About Manchester's question at 228. Just picking up on the earlier hospitality question and the importance of the city centre for the economy, is it feasible that with current social distancing rules it will be economically possible and with much smaller footfall for restaurants and bars and small shops to open, so the sort of economic feasibility of hospitality given the social distancing rules?
It's really challenging, Nigel, and I think it will vary from one organisation to another in terms of the physical nature of their premises, what they actually do within their within their locations, the amount of staff they have. I mean, the whole range of issues. So we're conscious about how difficult this will be for people. But that's why we've got this task force up and running with Sasha and Elise. We're looking to see what extra can we do just to give them that bit of extra leeway or that bit of extra support, cut the bureaucracy that they may be facing. And that work is well underway. It will be hard, I think, for all organisations to open in early July, as I think they may well have permission to do. And of course, it all depends upon them having customers, and that's why encouraging a safe return to the city centre of those who can will also be a part of this if we're going to support those businesses. So I'm still in discussions with the Chamber of Commerce and other business organisations around a template for return to the office. So not everybody returning at once, but sort of setting out a kind of basic kind of framework for how this happens. So let's say 25% of people in the first instance, staggering the arrival time of those 25% of people, maybe bringing some people in on one day and others on a different day, so we spread the number of people who are coming in and out of the office. These are discussions I'm having with the business community at the moment, and I think this is another part of supporting the hospitality industry, ensuring that there is a customer base for them in the city centre. It's all got to be done extremely carefully, and I'm in discussions with Marketing Manchester about a safe GM campaign, getting the message out there to people in our own city region, but actually across the UK, internationally, that we're going to do things properly, carefully, and if they're going to come here, it's a safe place to come in terms of the way we manage our bars and restaurants, but our public transport too. Building that confidence back in the city, we think, is crucial. So there's no cutting of corners here or kind of flouting of rules if it's going to create a problem of perception or damaged confidence. So we've got to do this properly, carefully, but we've got to recognise that we need to get the city people back in the city region again if we're going to support those businesses. So it's a real difficult balancing act, but it's one that we're well on with now.
Thanks. On the same theme, Phil McCann from Radio Manchester has a question at 2:33. So if hospitality businesses need to implement the social distancing when they reopen, will they need extra support, given that this will damage the profit margin and potentially put many of them out of business? So what kind of support should the government give them, and what kind of support could Greater Manchester City Region give them?
Thanks, Phil. In some ways it's kind of small beer, you might say, but then again, not in another. There's a United We Stream service we've launched has been able to raise now, just under £400,000, and this is principally funding that is there to support our nighttime economy. That's why we set it up, or why Sasha Lord set it up, recognising that they really would need help through this period. So there is some money there. There is other Greater Manchester support available that we've set up through the Growth Company. In terms of the government support that they might need, I think it's continued access to some form of furlough scheme. Any abrupt end to the furlough scheme, I think, could be most damaging for the hospitality industry. And I think we need to continue to make an argument for that. I think the Chancellor has made a statement in recent days about how it won't continue in its current form beyond August. I think that could create real problems for our hospitality industry, and we need to make an argument for them to the government that this support through furlough, I think, will need to continue for the rest of this year.
Thanks. And another question from Phil. What is being done locally to deal with the potential for a second spike in infections, especially if you're against the idea of local lockdowns? That's at 2:32.
I think, Phil, it's all about that testing and contact tracing. And these are two sides of one coin. They really need to knit very kind of closely together. That, in my view, is what can keep. If you've got that right, you've then got your grip on the virus at a local level, which means you're chasing down every infection. And that is the way to do this, and asking people individually to self-isolate. the whole question, I think, of more broader localized lockdowns only arises because you haven't got that system in place. But that says to me that we're going too fast here. You know, get the testing and tracking right, and then work on that basis. The idea of localized lockdowns shouldn't really arise, I don't think. And even if they do, it should be in extremis when everything else has failed. So, you know, that is how I would answer your question about what is being done to avoid a second spike. And it's why we're investing a huge amount of effort into this at a Greater Manchester level to get this right. In fact, we argued with others across the country for proper local involvement in this system. We weren't being offered that just a couple of weeks ago. Thanks to the arguments Greater Manchester colleagues have made and others, we actually now have an input, a role within this system. But for me, that's what this is all about. All focus should be on that now. And it's why I say, you know, the kind of events of recent days are quite frustrating, to be honest, because it means every day we're discussing issues that relate to the situation in Westminster is another day when we're not discussing what needs to be done to get this right. And it's often only been when the public debate has flushed out weaknesses in the testing and tracking and tracing system that we've actually been able to make progress. So we need to get focus back on that. For me, that is how you avoid the risk of a second spike, or even if there is to be one, you ensure that you are in a position to deal with it as best as.
Thanks. I'm going to go to Jen Williams at the MEN at 2:40. This question for you, Andy. Do you think that the money that was brought forward this weekend to provide homes for those rough sleepers who are currently inside as a result of the Everyone In policy was in any way the result of the plans to wind up the original approach being highlighted in the press?
Yes, I think so, because I think the paper that went to the Greater Manchester Committee highlighted significant gaps in the Everyone In policy. And I don't think those gaps have gone away, Jen, as welcome as this announcement was at the weekend. You know, the announcement relates to the provision of move-on accommodation beyond hotel accommodation, which is important because that is needed. And I've spoken here before about the challenge of moving everybody from the temporary accommodation into a longer term option. So we're glad that the government is addressing that issue and committing to such a large number of properties, either as new build or as conversion. Now, we would certainly want to play a full part in that and would want as many of the 6,000 to be based here in Greater Manchester. But the problem with the announcement is it kind of gives an impression that something is being done and it's solving everything, when actually it isn't. Because we're still in a position where, as I said before, we have 661 people still accommodated. We don't believe we've been given any funding for those people yet, because the second tranche of local government funding was allocated on a population basis, as you know. And of course, homelessness isn't an issue that's equally felt by all local authorities all over the country. It is particularly concentrated in certain areas, particularly city centres and city regions. So I think if you were to ask our 10 councils, I don't think they feel they've been given money to deal with this challenge of actually paying for the accommodation of people now. And I'm waiting to hear from the government where they think that money is meant to come from, given that they're allocating to funding to councils now without any deprivation waiting. So, you know, how are they meant to find that? And then you come to the issue of course, this thing that I keep raising about people identified homeless pre-lockdown and those post. What we're seeing is a significant number of people who are new to the streets since lockdown. In terms of no recourse to public funds, I can give you a figure today, I think of 71, which is the number of people accommodated in hotels currently, with no recourse to public funds. So again, a question for the government: how can you honestly stand by a policy of everyone in when you're also saying there are some people for whom there is no recourse to public funds? And it's these discrepancies that the government hasn't dealt with, as welcome as what they said at the weekend was. And I'm kind of pleased to hear the Secretary of State's personal commitment to the issue. It's clear his focus is on this particular issue, but it needs to be, because we're a month or so left now of hotel accommodation, and until the government fill the gaps that I've just mentioned to you, I don't see how we're going to have the successful transition that he clearly wants. And I would encourage the government to get even more focused on that, not what comes later down the line, but how you fund people right now, because it's an unfair ask of our councils to do this on an unfunded basis.
Another question from Jen. Do you still think, as per your comments in the Observer 10 days or so ago, that the government's strategy is London-centric, particularly given the existence of a transformation board that has been set up in conjunction with the government to lead the capital out of this crisis?
Yes, I do. I do stand by what I said. I think I can point to some helpful moves in the last week, possibly that was a response to what I said. Certainly the funding package for Metrolink was at the higher end of our expectations. Well, certainly what we think well, didn't fully fund us either, I should say, but it was better than the first round of funding that we received. I think the response on homelessness shows that concerns that were raised by Greater Manchester, as you acknowledged a moment ago, appear to have been given a response. But then we find ourselves back in a position today where there's talk of localised lockdowns and all of the chaos that may bring for us without any meaningful input. And it does still feel to me that maybe London-centric is unfair. What I would say is there's a highly centralised approach to the management of this crisis that in the end isn't producing the best results. The best results will come when there is proper use of the local expertise and there is empowerment of communities to deal with these issues. So I think it is it's mixed picture, but I agree. I don't think there is enough focus on the ground, and the issue I will come back to is one raised by my colleague in Liverpool City Region, Steve Rotherham, yesterday. The failure to fund councils fairly across the country, in the end, could be the undoing of a successful national response. With a virus that is clearly linked to deprivation, it surely follows that you have to give most support to the communities that are facing the biggest challenge, and that isn't happening at the moment, and it needs to happen if we're to break out of this centralised, possibly London-centric approach.
Thanks, Andy. It's a question from Hannah Miller to Bev. Bev, you mentioned 3 women have died in a domestic situation in GM during lockdown. How does that compare to a normal amount during this length of time?
Okay, thanks, Hannah. Well, month to month, there isn't a normal. It varies a lot. Many months there's none, and then in some months there's 1 or 2. What I can say that over the last 2 financial years, so from April 18 to March 19 and from March 19 to April 20, there were 5 domestic homicides in each of those years in total. So it looks concerning that there's 3 in a single month. But I can't tell you yet till we see the rest of the year whether that will pan out to be over the year any more than in the last couple of years anyway. But obviously it is concerning because of the conditions under which many families are living or have been living at the moment.
Thanks, Bev. So the final question is one to Andy. It's again from Jen. Finally, do you have any concerns about the spike in evictions once the current Section 21 ban is lifted and once enhanced housing benefit ends? And do you have any sense of when that might be?
Thanks, Jen. Yes, I have very major concerns about that. And I think what we might see is even greater numbers of people coming new to the streets in the months that lie ahead of us if there is no change on the current deadline for both of those policies. So I think we're looking at a range of issues here, aren't we? That the government need to fix. So far, we've had very reassuring words from the Secretary of State, the appointment of Louise Casey, which we support. but there's a list of issues now that's growing. It's council funding to support people properly. It's the no recourse to public funds issue. It's work, as Bev has said before, with our prison and probation colleagues to prevent people coming new to the street without support. There's the whole question of Section 21 evictions, and if all of a sudden they can start again, what that will mean. And of course, enhanced housing benefit. And it's that last one I would say is absolutely critical. You know, if that doesn't keep following the enhanced level, then I think, you know, we are looking at very serious consequences once people who are currently on furlough lose furlough. You know, we're told that there are a large number of people on furlough in Greater Manchester whose jobs already have basically ceased to exist. And, you know, what comes after this could be far more significant than anything that we've dealt with so far. And the implications for the numbers of people homeless could be significant. So, you know, I want to see more from the government to show that it really understands what is needed to be put in place to ensure a successful transition of the everyone in policy. I've heard some encouraging noises, but I've not seen a proper strategy, a proper funded strategy to make sure that it works. But I have great confidence in Louise Casey. I'm absolutely certain she'll be talking to the government about this as we speak. And I know she wouldn't put her name to a plan if it were not to have all of those necessary components in place. But, you know, without that recognition that it's our councils that face the biggest challenge and therefore need to be funded accordingly, then I would have very serious concerns about how any of this is going to work. But thank you. And well done to you, Jen, for the work that you've done on this.
That's all our questions. So if you, Bev, have any final comments.
Bev?
I haven't any final comments, Andy. I think I've made all my comments. As I say, I think as far as police concerned, we're in a period of transition at the minute. I hope the government can clarify towards the end of this week, both for the public and for the police services across the country, exactly what they expect of us all.
Thanks, Bev. And just from my point of view, to say that it feels, well, there's two ways of looking at the situation that we've got right now. On the one hand, as I said at the beginning, the picture is definitely heading much more quickly now in the right direction in Greater Manchester. With care homes, something that we've got to keep a very close eye on. It's not improving in care homes in the same rate as it is in hospitals or in wider society, and that is obviously a cause for concern for us. So that's, but having said that, the picture is much improved from the one we were looking at 2 or 3 weeks ago. That said, I think our challenge is becoming more complicated because of the current political context in which we're trying to work. And as we look at further loosening over the coming days, you know, these challenges will only increase. So, you know, I think the government needs to be pulling out all of the stops this week to get that world-beating testing and tracking system in place that it promised. That is the key to this. That is the key to building the confidence. Talking of putting communities under lockdown, I personally don't think helps us at all at this particular moment in time. I think focus on what's been promised, that world-beating system, and then deliver that and build confidence from there. So that's how it looks to us for today. Thank you again for joining us, everybody. And as ever, I've got to say we're really grateful for the way you report these briefings. It's very direct but very fair. And I think we've got to, all of us, work hard to get more and more facts out there for the public. We're going into a more complicated part of this now. So the more we empower people with information and facts, the better. So thank you for all of your help in that. And thank you for joining us again today.